The symbol of the circle is repeated many times in the course of Steven Spielberg's 2001 film AI. The symbol is primarily associated with David, the protagonist of the film. For instance, when he's at the home of Monica, on two occasions we see him surrounded by a circle. His bed is a pod in a circular shape, and at a certain point, there's a dinner scene where the camera is placed above and shines down through a circular light fixture. Later in the film, when David is exiled to the forest by Monica, he is preoccupied by the moon. When he is stuck down on the bottom of the ocean staring at the blue fairy for 2,000 odd years, it is a Ferris wheel, circular shape, that holds him down on the bottom. And when he is speaking with the hyper-advanced mecha near the film's end, there is a circular window. These are only a few of numerous images of the circle in the film. So why is the image there? Well, perennially the circle has been a symbol of wholeness, completeness. It is a symbol in which beginning and end are the same. Start and finish are the same. Now, obviously, every character in the film is seeking for wholeness of one kind or another. Every main character in the film. Professor Hobby, he has lost his son. There's a hole in his heart. He tries to fill that hole by creating an artificial boy. This, of course, cannot actually relieve him of his grief. He remains melancholy. He remains bereft. However, because he is Orga, we can conceive possibly of his having another organic child that might ultimately fulfill his longing for a child. Monica, she too is missing a child when the film opens. She thinks that her son Martin will die. He has some terrible disease, so she purchases David in hopes that David will fulfill her. Of course, he does not. Luckily for her, her son does come back and heals, and she's able to be reunited with him. But what about David? He is programmed to love and yearn easily as intensely as Professor Hobby and Monica, if not more. But the tragedy of David's character is that it is impossible for him, once he is exiled from Monica, to achieve the kind of completeness that he desires. So really, the majority of the film is spent tracking David's various failed attempts to reunite with Monica. And of course, at a certain point, the Monica character is replaced with female proxies. There's the female figure in Professor Hobby's lab. He returns to Professor Hobby hoping that Professor Hobby can, like the blue fairy, turn him into a real boy. Of course, he cannot. So this is another sort of mother figure that fails him. When he does sink to the bottom of the ocean and stares at the blue fairy for 2,000 years, this blue fairy becomes another proxy for Monica. Of course, this blue fairy, who, by the way, looks almost just like Monica, cannot fulfill his desire. He yearns for 2,000 years. At the film's end, when the hyper-advanced mecha allow him to recreate a day with Monica, he knows that this is not really Monica. He knows that this is only a one-day affair. When it ends, he will never have contact with Monica again, but the yearning will not go away. The hyper-advanced mecha do say, okay, he's now asleep at the end of the day, and he is with his dreams. Well, what does this mean? Does this mean that he's still yearning for Monica in his dreams? This is the first time in the film he's actually gone to sleep. Does it mean that this is just one other programmed activity of David and that he will wake up and still be fraught with yearning? So the circle through much of the film is ironic, I would argue, because this is very much a film about how everyone is riddled with yearning that is largely unfulfilled. And that's what it means, if anything, to be human in this film. Has nothing to do with biology. It has to do with the capacity to yearn for something you cannot have, which is a pretty grim vision of what it means to be a human, but there it is. So that makes us think that the circle in the film is not so much a symbol of unity, maybe, but a symbol of repetition. That's another motif the circle suggests, repetition without difference. And we have a lot of repetition in the film suggesting that characters are stuck in one state from which they cannot remove themselves. We never see Professor Hobby find any joy in another child. We never see Monica find any joy, really, in Martin once he comes back, and she definitely doesn't find much joy in David either. And of course, we see David himself continually having the same experience of longing. This idea of the circle as vicious repetition, repetition without a difference, is borne out in several ways, not only with the repetition of the circular symbol, but also with the repetition of female figures in David's life. And in fact, this repetition of the feminine is really emphasized in the fact that Sheila, at the beginning of the film, the android that Professor Hobby uses for his demonstration, she is using a compact case to make herself up at the scene's end. And then we shift immediately to Monica in the car. Again, she herself is using a compact case, putting makeup on. So there's a repetition there of women putting on makeup. And of course, Sheila and Monica look almost exactly alike. There is the repetition of the female form we see in Professor Hobby's lab. And then, of course, the blue fairy looks like Monica as well. So many critics fault the film. This film was originally developed by Stanley Kubrick, famous for his darkly satirical vision of the world. Many critics felt that Steven Spielberg, a more popular, humanistic, warm, optimistic director, many feared that he would take away the bite of Kubrick in the film. Well, I don't think that's the case. I think Spielberg here shows a very dark version of what it means to be a human being. And if this is a universe that has any cogency, it's what I would call a Gnostic universe. It's a universe where makers ultimately fail their creatures and leave them abandoned and longing and melancholy.